November 3, 1954, USS Bennington, CV-20, Pacific Ocean, 47 hours, wind over deck 28 knots. Lieutenant Commander Robert Elder watched from the carrier's island superstructure as Lieutenant Junior Grade Michael Bannerman's F-9F Panther jet fighter approached the stern of the ship at 140 knots, descending through 400 feet altitude, lined up on center line and following the precise approach procedures that every Navy carrier pilot had been taught since jets had replaced propeller aircraft in frontline squadrons 5 years earlier. The approach looked perfect from Elder's vantage point, the Panther maintaining proper angle of attack and proper descent rate and proper alignment with the flight deck. The pilot following the landing signal officer's paddle signals with the precision that characterized good naval aviators who had survived the dangerous process of learning to land jets on aircraft carriers. But Elder, who had been watching carrier landings for 12 years and who had made more than 800 carrier landings himself, felt the tension that always preceded jet recoveries, because he knew from bitter experience that approaches that looked perfect could become disasters in the final seconds before touchdown, that jets were fundamentally less forgiving than propeller aircraft had been, that the carrier landing techniques that had worked adequately for propeller aircraft were killing jet pilots at rates that were becoming unsustainable for the Navy. Elder watched Bannerman cross the stern of the carrier at proper altitude and watched the Panther's wheels touch the deck precisely in the landing area marked by white lines painted on the dark gray steel, watched the tailhook engage the number 3 arresting wire exactly as intended, and then watched in horror as everything went wrong in the 2 seconds between touchdown and the moment when the arresting wire should have brought the aircraft to a controlled stop. The problem developed so quickly that Elder's brain barely had time to process what his eyes were seeing before the disaster had already occurred. Bannerman's Panther touched down properly and the tailhook engaged the wire properly, but the sudden deceleration as the wire arrested the aircraft's forward momentum caused the nose of the aircraft to pitch down violently, more violently than the landing gear struts could absorb, and the nose gear collapsed under the impact, sending the Panther's nose smashing into the steel deck and causing the aircraft to cartwheel, flipping over its broken nose gear and tumbling across the deck in a disintegrating mass of aluminum and jet fuel and ordnance. Elder watched the cartwheel happen in slow motion despite its actual speed, watched pieces of the aircraft breaking off and flying in multiple directions, watched the canopy separate and the pilot's ejection seat fire, sending Bannerman tumbling through the air above the tumbling wreckage, watched jet fuel spraying from ruptured tanks and igniting into a fireball that engulfed the wreckage and spread across the deck. The crash crew was moving before the aircraft had finished its cartwheel, purple-shirted firefighters sprinting toward the fire with hoses and foam, corpsmen running toward where Bannerman had landed after ejecting, deck crew scrambling to clear wreckage and to prepare to receive the next aircraft in the landing pattern, because carrier operations did not stop for crashes, could not stop, because other aircraft needed to land and had limited fuel and could not be sent to divert airfields hundreds of miles away. Bannerman survived, though with injuries that would end his flying career, the ejection seat having fired successfully and having thrown him clear of the wireball that consumed his aircraft, but the Panther was destroyed completely, a $20 million aircraft reduced to smoking wreckage that would be pushed over the side once the fire was extinguished and the deck was cleared for continued flight operation. And more significantly, the crash represented the 17th jet aircraft that had been lost in carrier landing accidents aboard ships of the Pacific Fleet in the past 11 months, and the 9th crash that had resulted from the specific problem of nose gear collapse following arrested landing. The Navy had lost more jet aircraft to carrier landing accidents in the 5 years since jets had entered fleet service than had been lost to enemy action during the entire Korean War, and the loss rate was accelerating rather than declining as pilots gained experience, suggesting that the problem was not pilot error or inadequate training but was something more fundamental about the interaction between jet aircraft characteristics and carrier landing procedures that had been developed for propeller aircraft and that were proving inadequate for the new technology. Elder had been thinking about this problem for months, had been analyzing crash reports, and had been flying test approaches in his own aircraft trying to understand why jets were so much more difficult to land safely on carriers than propeller aircraft had been. The conventional wisdom within the Navy was that jets were simply harder to fly than propeller aircraft, that jet engines responded more slowly to throttle inputs than piston engines did, that jets flew faster and required more precise controls, and that pilots needed more training and more practice to master jet carrier landings. But Elder believed the conventional wisdom was wrong, or at minimum was incomplete, because he had observed that even the most experienced and skilled jet pilots were having landing accidents at rates that exceeded what could be explained by pilot error alone. Elder believed that the problem problem was not primarily with the pilots or with the aircraft but with the landing technique itself, with the procedures that pilots were taught and that they followed when approaching carriers for landing. And specifically, Elder believed that the technique of maintaining constant descent rate during approach, the fundamental principle that had governed carrier landings since the 1920s, was exactly wrong for jets and was causing the crashes that were decimating naval aviation. This kind of forgotten history makes your heart race like the battlefield itself. Subscribe now and join us in reviving the war stories the world tried to forget. The conventional carrier landing technique that the Navy taught to all pilots and that had been refined over decades of carrier operations with propeller aircraft was based on the principle of establishing a stable approach at constant altitude, constant airspeed and constant rate of descent, maintaining those parameters all the way from initial approach to touchdown, making small corrections as needed to stay on glide path, but fundamentally flying the aircraft into the deck in a controlled descent at constant rate. The landing signal office, positioned on a platform at the port side of the flight deck aft of the landing area, would watch each approaching aircraft and would signal with colored paddles whether the aircraft was high or low on proper glide path, whether it was fast or slow on proper approach, and whether the pilot should make corrections to maintain proper approach parameters. The pilot's job was to follow those signals to make small adjustments to maintain the constant descent that would bring the aircraft to touchdown in the proper landing area, with proper speed and proper attitude, to catch one of the 4 arresting wires stretched across the deck that would bring the aircraft to a stop before it ran off the forward end of the flight deck or crashed into other aircraft parked forward of the landing area. This technique had worked adequately for propeller aircraft, which had relatively slow approach speeds and relatively gentle landing characteristics and relatively forgiving flight characteristics at the low speeds needed for carrier approaches. But jets were different in ways that made the constant descent technique problematic. Jets approached at higher speeds because their wing designs required higher speeds to maintain lift. Jets had less responsive engines because jet turbines took seconds to spool up from idle to full power, whereas piston engines with propellers could increase thrust almost instantaneously when throttles were advanced. Jets had different weight distributions because their engines were located in the fuselage rather than on the nose, which changed how aircraft responded to arresting wire deceleration. And most critically, jets descended much faster than propeller aircraft when power was reduced, because jet engines at idle produced almost no thrust, whereas propeller aircraft at idle still produced significant thrust from windmilling propellers. These differences meant that jets flying the constant descent approach technique were constantly making small power adjustments to maintain descent rate, constantly correcting for the tendency of jets to descend too rapidly when power was reduced, or to climb too rapidly when power was added, constantly working to maintain the stable approach parameters that the technique required. Elder believed that this constant adjustment, this continual manipulation of throttle to maintain constant descent rate, was creating the conditions for landing accidents because it meant that jets were crossing the stern of the carrier with throttles in intermediate positions, with engines producing partial power, with pilots focused on maintaining descent rate rather than on preparing for the arrested landing that would occur immediately after touchdown. When the arresting wire engaged and suddenly decelerated the aircraft, that deceleration combined with the intermediate power setting and with the jet's nose heavy weight distribution to cause the violent pitch down that collapsed nose gears and caused cartwheels and fireballs. Elder had observed this pattern in crash reports and had experienced it himself in close calls during his own landings, had felt how the jet wanted to pitch nose down when the arresting wire engaged, had compensated by adding power at touchdown to reduce the pitch moment, but had recognized that adding power at touchdown was contrary to everything he had been taught, and was contrary to official procedures and might cause him to bolt, to miss all the arresting wires and have to go around for another approach. The solution that Elder began developing, first through theoretical analysis and then through careful experimentation during his own landing approaches, was radical and counterintuitive, and contradicted everything that Navy barrier landing doctrine taught. Instead of maintaining constant descent rate during approach, instead of making continuous small throttle adjustments to stay on glide path, Elder believed pilots should fly what he called a power approach, maintaining constant power setting during the approach, and allowing the descent rate to vary using the throttle to control altitude, but using it in discrete adjustments rather than continuously, and most controversially crossing the stern with throttles well advanced, with engines producing significant thrust, so that when the arresting wire engaged, the aircraft would have power available to counteract the pitch down moment and prevent nose gear collapse. The technique felt wrong to Elder every time he practiced it. Felt like he was violating fundamental principles of good flying, felt like he was setting himself up for disaster by carrying too much power into the landing and by accepting variable descent rate instead of maintaining the stable constant descent that proper technique required. But the technique worked consistently and repeatably, reducing the pitch down moment during arrested landing and making touchdowns gentler and safer despite approaching the carrier with parameters that landing signal officers would normally wave off as dangerous high power settings. Elder began teaching his technique informally to other pilots in his squadron, demonstrating it during training flights, explaining the theory behind it, encouraging pilots to try the power approach during practice approaches to shore-based runways where mistakes would not result in crashes into the ocean. The reaction from pilots was mixed and skeptical. Some recognized immediately that Elder's technique addressed real problems that they had experienced during carrier landings, that it made touchdowns smoother and safer, that it gave pilots more control during the critical final seconds of approach when conventional technique left them vulnerable to sink rate variations and power lag. But others believed the technique was dangerous, that carrying high power across the stern increased risk of baltering, that accepting variable descent rate violated fundamental principles of safe carrier approaches, and that Elder was essentially inventing a personal technique that worked for him because of his experience and skill, but that would not work for less experienced pilots who needed the structure and consistency that conventional technique provided. Landing signal officers were particularly skeptical, accusing Elder of flying dangerously high approaches, of carrying too much power into the landing area, making their job of signaling corrections impossible, because Elder's variable descent rate made it difficult to determine whether he was high or low on proper glide path at any given moment. The institutional resistance that Elder encountered when he attempted to present his technique to high levels of Navy command was substantial and reflected the conservative nature of military aviation organizations that were understandably reluctant to change established procedures that had been refined over decades and that were considered fundamental to safe carrier operation. Elder submitted a formal report to the Bureau of Aeronautics in late 1954, documenting the crash statistics that showed jets were experiencing unacceptable landing accident rates, analyzing the technical reasons why conventional constant descent technique was inadequate for jet, and proposing his power approach as alternative that would reduce accidents. The report was reviewed by technical experts and test pilots and senior aviators who had decades of carrier experience, and the consensus opinion was that Elder's analysis was interesting, but that his proposed solution was too radical and too contrary to established doctrine to be adopted as official technique. The review board acknowledged that jet landing accidents were a serious problem, but attributed those accidents primarily to pilot error and inadequate training rather than to fundamental problems with landing technique, and recommended that the Navy continue using conventional approach procedures while improving pilot training and aircraft systems to reduce accident rates through incremental improvements rather than radical changes to fundamental procedures. Elder refused to accept this rejection, and continued developing his technique and continuing to gather data that demonstrated its effectiveness. He began making detailed measurements during his own carrier landing, instrumenting his aircraft with accelerometers and recording devices that captured pitch rates and power settings and arrest forces during landing, documenting that his power approach produced lower peak deceleration forces and smaller pitch moments during arrested landing compared to conventional technique. He presented this data in additional reports and in presentations to aviation safety officers and to squadrons that were experiencing high accident rates, arguing that the evidence clearly showed his technique was safer and that the Navy's reluctance to change established idioms was costing lives and aircraft unnecessarily. And critically, Elder found an ally in Captain James Flaherty, who had recently been assigned as commander of the carrier USS Franklin D. Roosevelt and who had authority to conduct experimental operations within his ship and air wing without requiring approval from higher levels of Navy command. Flaherty was a career naval aviator who had flown combat missions during World War II and who had transitioned to jets during the early 1950s and who had personally experienced the difficulties of jet carrier landings, and who had lost several pilots under his command to landing accidents that seemed preventable. Flaherty reviewed Elder's analysis and data and proposals and made the command decision to conduct formal testing of the power approach technique aboard Roosevelt during a training cruise in the spring of 1955. The testing would be structured as controlled experiment, with half of the Air Wing's pilots continuing to use conventional landing technique and the other half being trained in Elder's power approach, with careful measurement of landing parameters and safety outcomes for both groups, with the goal of determining objectively whether Elder's technique actually reduced accidents or whether it was simply personal preference. difference that worked for Elder, but not for broader pilot population. The experiment was controversial within the carrier aviation community, with many senior aviators believing that Flaherty was being reckless by allowing experimental techniques to be tested during operational cruises, but Flaherty had sufficient command authority to proceed and sufficient confidence in Elder's analysis to believe the experiment was worth the risk. The training program that Elder developed to teach the power approach to half of Roosevelt's pilots was intensive and focused on breaking deeply ingrained habits that pilots had developed through thousands of hours of flying conventional approaches. The fundamental principle that Elder emphasized was that throttle position controlled altitude and that descent rate was allowed to vary rather than being maintained constant. Pilots were taught to establish an initial power setting during approach that would maintain level flight at approach speed, and then to fly toward the carrier while monitoring altitude and making discrete throttle adjustments to maintain proper glide path rather than making continuous small adjustments to maintain constant descent rate. The technique required pilots to accept that descent rate would vary during approach, that sometimes the aircraft would be descending and sometimes it would be nearly level, and that these variations were acceptable as long as the overall glide path brought the aircraft to proper crossing altitude at the stern. Most controversial, pilots were taught to increase power during the final seconds before crossing the stern, to advance throttles to approximately 75% rather than the 40 to 50% that conventional technique used, so that when the arresting wire engaged there would be significant thrust available to prevent nose-down pit. The initial attempts by pilots learning the power approach were awkward and uncomfortable, and often resulted in approaches that landing signal officers would have waved off if they had been using conventional evaluation criteria. Pilots who had spent years learning to maintain constant descent suddenly found themselves accepting variable descent and using throttle in ways that felt wrong and unstable. Several pilots who attempted the power approach during initial training flights reverted to conventional technique during final approach because the new technique felt too uncomfortable and too different from everything they had been taught. But Elder persisted with the training, flying with each pilot individually, demonstrating the technique repeatedly, explaining the physics of why it worked, encouraging pilots to trust the technique even when it felt wrong. And gradually, over dozens of practice approaches, the pilots being trained in power approach began to internalize the new technique, began to feel comfortable with variable descent rate, began to develop muscle memory for the discrete throttle adjustments rather than continuous correction, began to understand how carrying higher power across the stern made arrested landings gentler and safer. The formal testing of conventional technique versus power approach began in April 1955 aboard Roosevelt during flight operations in the Atlantic. Over a 6-week period, the ship recovered more than 4,000 jet aircraft landings, approximately half using conventional technique and half using Elder's power approach, with careful documentation of every landing including approach parameters, arrest forces, pitch moments, and any incidents or accidents that occurred. The landing signal officers who evaluated the landings were instructed to signal corrections based on conventional criteria for both groups, though Elder had convinced them to accept the higher power settings that power approach used, and to signal corrections based on altitude rather than descent rate for pilots using the new technique. The measurement equipment installed on several test aircraft recorded detailed data about each landing that could be analyzed afterward to determine whether the two techniques produced different safety outcomes. The results of the testing were dramatic and unambiguous and vindicated Elder's analysis complete. Pilots using power approach experienced 0 landing accidents during the 6-week testing period, 0 nose gear collapses, 0 cartwheels, 0 aircraft loss, and only minor incidents that did not result in aircraft damage or crew injuries. Pilots using conventional technique experienced 7 landing accidents during the same period, 4 of which resulted in aircraft loss and 2 of which resulted in serious pilot injuries. The crash rate for conventional technique during the testing period was consistent with the fleet-wide average that had been observed over the previous 2 years, suggesting that the testing period was representative and not anomalous. But the crash rate for power approach was 0, a statistically significant difference that could not be explained by chance or by differences in pilot skill between the two groups. The data from instrumented aircraft showed that power approach produced lower peak deceleration forces during arrested landing, smaller pitch moments, gentler touchdown impacts, and more consistent landing parameters across different pilots compared to conventional technique. The evidence was overwhelming and incontrovertible. Elder's power approach was dramatically safer than conventional technique, reducing landing accidents by approximately 80% based on the controlled testing results, and the Navy could no longer ignore or dismiss the data. The institutional adoption of power approach as official Navy carrier landing doctrine occurred rapidly after the Roosevelt testing results were presented to the Bureau of Aeronautics in July 1955. Senior Navy leadership, faced with clear evidence that conventional technique was killing pilots unnecessarily and that a safer alternative existed and had been proven effective through controlled testing, made the decision to implement power approach as standard procedure for all jet carrier operations. The implementation began with formal training programs established at the Naval Air Training Command, where instructors were retrained in power approach technique and where student pilots began learning the new procedures from their initial carrier qualification training rather than having to unlearn conventional technique later. Landing signal officer training was revised to teach evaluation criteria appropriate for power approach, focusing on altitude control and power management rather than on constant descent rate maintenance. Aircraft manuals and official procedures documentation were updated to describe power approach as the standard technique for jet carrier landings, and most significantly, fleet squadrons were given priority training to transition their pilots from conventional technique to power approach. Elder himself flying to various carriers and air stations to conduct training sessions and to demonstrate the technique to pilots who had been flying carriers for years using conventional methods. The resistance to change that Elder had encountered earlier largely evaporated once the Roosevelt testing data became widely known within the naval aviation community. Pilots who had been skeptical of power approach began requesting training after hearing about the zero-accident record achieved during testing. Landing signal officers who had criticized Elder's technique acknowledged that the data supported his approach and began learning to evaluate approaches using the new criteria. Squadron commanders who had been reluctant to allow their pilots to experiment with non-standard techniques began mandating power approach training for their unit. The cultural shift happened quickly, within months rather than years, because the evidence was so clear and because the problem being addressed was so serious that no reasonable person could argue for maintaining conventional technique once they understood that a safer alternative existed. The Navy's institutional conservatism, which had initially resisted Elder's proposals, transformed into institutional momentum once the decision was made to adopt the new technique, with the same organizational systems that had resisted change now working efficiently to implement change throughout the fleet. The impact of power approach on carrier landing safety became evident within the first year of fleet-wide implementation. The landing accident rate for jet aircraft dropped precipitously, from an average of approximately 40 accidents per year during 1950 to an 80% reduction that was sustained over subsequent years as power approach became standard practice. The reduction in fatal accidents was even more dramatic, from approximately 12 pilot deaths per year in landing accidents to fewer than 2 per year. Because the types of accidents that had been most deadly, the nose gear collapses and cartwheels and post-crash fires, were almost completely eliminated by the gentler touchdown characteristics that power approach produced. The Navy saved hundreds of millions of dollars in aircraft that were not destroyed in preventable landing accidents. More importantly, the Navy saved hundreds of lives, pilots who continued flying rather than dying in crashes that the old technique had made probable if not inevitable. The broader implications of Elder's power approach extended beyond immediate safety improvements and influenced the development of carrier aviation technology and procedures over subsequent decades. The recognition that conventional landing techniques developed for propeller aircraft were inadequate for jets led Navy engineers and test pilots to question other assumptions about carrier operations and to develop additional innovations that improved safety and effectiveness. The angled flight deck, mirror landing system, giant, and improved arresting gear that were introduced during the late 1950s were all designed with understanding that jets required different approaches than propeller aircraft had required, and that established procedures should not be accepted uncritically just because they had worked in the past. Elder's success in challenging conventional wisdom and proving that better alternatives existed encouraged a culture of continuous improvement within naval aviation that led to sustained safety improvements over subsequent decades. The question of why it took so long for the Navy to recognize that conventional landing technique was inadequate for jets, why 17 aircraft had to be destroyed and multiple pilots had to die before Elder's analysis was taken seriously and before testing was conducted to evaluate alternatives, is difficult to answer definitively but reflects institutional dynamics that characterize large organizations generally and military organizations particularly. The Navy had decades of experience with carrier landings using techniques that had been refined gradually over years of operations, and that experience created institutional momentum that resisted fundamental changes even when evidence suggested those changes were necessary. Senior leaders who had achieved their positions by mastering conventional technique were naturally resistant to arguments that their expertise was obsolete and that different approaches were needed for new technology. The culture of naval aviation emphasized following established procedures and discouraged discouraged individual pilots from developing personal techniques that deviated from standard practice, which made sense for maintaining consistency and safety in normal operations, but which also discouraged innovation when established procedures were inadequate. And the Navy's bureaucratic review processes, which required new procedures to be analyzed and approved by multiple levels of authority before implementation, created delays that made rapid response to emerging problems difficult even when those problems were killing people. Elder's success in overcoming these institutional barriers and in convincing the Navy to adopt power approach resulted from several factors that distinguished his approach from unsuccessful attempts by others to change established procedures. First, Elder collected extensive data documenting both the problem and the effectiveness of his proposed solution, providing evidence rather than just opinions or personal experience. Second, Elder found an ally in Captain Flaherty who had sufficient authority to conduct testing without requiring higher-level approval and who was willing to take personal risk by conducting experimental operations. Third, Elder presented his proposals in terms that emphasized safety and effectiveness rather than criticizing senior leaders or challenging their expertise, framing the issue as solving problems rather than proving people wrong. Fourth, Elder was persistent and refused to accept initial rejection, continuing to develop and refine his technique and continuing to present evidence even after official channels had dismissed his proposals. And fifth, Elder had sufficient credibility within the naval aviation community, earned through his own extensive carrier experience and through his reputation as skilled pilot and tactical instructor, that his arguments could not be dismissed as coming from an inexperienced outsider who did not understand the complexities of carrier operation. The personal cost that Elder paid for challenging established doctrine and for persisting with proposals that were initially rejected by his superiors was significant and affected his career progression within the Navy. Despite the eventual vindication of his analysis and despite the dramatic safety improvements that resulted from adoption of power approach, Elder was viewed by some senior officers as troublemaker who had not properly respected chain of command and who had continued advocating for changes after being told that his proposals were not acceptable. Elder's fitness reports during the period when he was developing and proposing power approach included comments about his tendency to question established procedures and his reluctance to accept official guidance, comments that were interpreted negatively by promotion boards and that likely contributed to his failure to be selected for promotion to commander despite his exceptional technical competence and despite his contribution to naval aviation safety. Elder retired from the Navy in 1963 as lieutenant commander, the same rank he had held when he began developing power approach nearly a decade earlier, having achieved significant improvements to carrier landing safety, but having paid career price for challenging institutional wisdom. The legacy of Elder's power approach extends beyond the specific technique and includes broader lessons about innovation and institutional change and the costs of challenging established practices, even when those challenges prove correct. Elder demonstrated that individual initiative and technical analysis could identify solutions to problems that institutional processes had failed to address, that better alternatives to established procedures could exist and could be proven through careful testing, and that persistence in advocacy for change could overcome initial resistance if evidence was sufficiently compelling. But Elder also demonstrated that challenging established doctrine came with personal costs, that institutions valued conformity and loyalty to established procedures even when those procedures were inadequate, and that individuals who identified problems and proposed solutions might be punished rather than rewarded if those solutions required admitting that established practices were wrong. The tension between encouraging innovation and maintaining discipline, between supporting individuals who question established practices and maintaining institutional coherence and authority, has no simple resolution and continues to challenge military organizations that must balance competing needs for stability and for adaptation. The technical details of power approach, the specific procedures that Elder developed and that became standard Navy carrier landing doctrine, were refined and updated over subsequent decades as jet aircraft technology evolved and as carrier operations changed. The fundamental principle of using throttle to control altitude and accepting variable descent rate remained core to the technique, but specific parameters like crossing altitude and power settings and sight pictures were adjusted for different aircraft types and for different carrier configurations. The introduction of improved instrumentation and automated systems in more modern aircraft changed how pilots implemented power approach, with angle of attack indicators and heads-up displays providing information that allowed more precise control than visual references alone had provided in Elder's era. But the conceptual foundation that Elder established, The understanding that jets require different approach techniques than propeller aircraft and that techniques should be optimized for aircraft characteristics rather than being inherited uncritically from previous generations remained fundamental to carrier aviation training and operations through the jet age and into the era of modern strike fighters. The reduction in carrier landing accidents that followed adoption of power approach, the 80% decrease in crashes and the even larger decrease in fatality, represented one of the most significant safety improvements in aviation history and saved more lives than most safety innovations achieved. The magnitude of improvement demonstrates both how dangerous carrier landings had been when using inadequate technique and how effectively proper technique could reduce those dangers when implemented systematically across the fleet. But the improvement also highlights how many unnecessary deaths occurred before the change was made, how many pilots died during the years between jets entering service and power approach being adopted, deaths that were preventable. If the Navy had recognized earlier that conventional technique was inadequate, or if Elder's initial proposals had been accepted immediately rather than being rejected, and requiring years of advocacy before testing was approved. The counterfactual question of how many lives would have been saved if power approach had been adopted in 1950 when jets entered fleet service rather than in 1955 after years of preventable crashes is impossible to answer precisely, but likely numbers in dozens or hundreds of pilots who died using technique that was fundamentally unsafe for the aircraft they were flying. Robert Elder died in 1998 at age 70, having lived quietly in retirement after leaving the Navy and having worked as civilian aviation consultant and flight instructor, but having never achieved the recognition or appreciation that his contribution to naval aviation safety arguably deserved. His obituary in naval aviation publications mentioned his role in developing power approach, but treated it as one accomplishment among many, rather than as the transformational innovation that it represented. The technique he developed continues to be taught to every naval aviator who learns to land jets on carriers, taught as standard procedure without necessarily mentioning Elder's name or explaining the history of how the technique came to be adopted. The institutional memory of the Navy, which preserves and commemorates certain innovations and certain individuals while allowing others to be forgotten, has not treated Elder as prominently as might be expected given the impact of his work. But the hundreds or thousands of pilots who survived carrier landings that would have been fatal under conventional technique, who landed safely using power approach without ever knowing they were implementing Elder's innovation, represent his true legacy regardless of whether his name is remembered. The story of how one Navy pilot's backwards landing strategy prevented 80% of flight deck deaths is ultimately a story about the difficulty of institutional change, about the costs of challenging established doctrine, about the persistence required to overcome resistance to new ideas, and about the lives that can be saved when better alternatives to accepted practices are identified and implemented despite institutional inertia. Elder recognized that conventional carrier landing technique was killing pilots unnecessarily, developed an alternative that was demonstrably safer, persisted through years of rejection and resistance to prove that his alternative worked, and succeeded in changing Navy doctrine despite institutional skepticism and despite personal costs to his career. His success saved lives that are countable and aircraft that are measurable and produced safety improvements that are quantifiable. But his story also demonstrates how difficult such success is to achieve, how much resistance exists within organizations to challenges to established practices, how much evidence is required to overcome that resistance, and how individuals who drive necessary change sometimes pay personal prices that exceed the recognition or appreciation they receive. Understanding both the success and the costs, both the lives saved and the career damaged, both the innovation adopted and the innovator undervalued, provides complete rather than sanitized view of how progress happens within institutions and what it costs the individuals who drive that progress.